Welcome to Research Design and Methods. We ended our previous session with this triangle where research design sat in the middle and was surrounded by limitations, constraints on any ideal research design. Those constraints were said to come from your research orientation, so Saunders's outer layer of his research onion, ethical constraints only relevant to primary data collection that will be revisited towards the end of the course, and practical constraints to do with resources, the type of audience you're targeting your research at, and so on. Now, let's spend the next few minutes clarifying what the research design is and what are the most used research designs in accounting and finance. The research design refers basically to your overall strategy employed into measuring, collecting, and analyzing your data. It is a blueprint, a justification for the way in which you can do those things. Now, if you remember, the research orientation was also serving as justification for your choice of one method over another or one group of methods over others. The difference between research design and research orientation is that the research design is a little bit more specific. So, for example, if your research orientation may be interpretativism, your research design could be a case study. So a little bit more narrowly defined than the much wider interpretativism. It is, however, more than the method itself, the method you may employ to collect and analyze your data. Research design is an overall structure of the research, the glue holding all the elements in your research project together. And it is evaluated in relation to its ability to draw unambiguous or relatively unambiguous conclusions and defend these against other plausible explanations. Now, depending on the research design, those conclusions are more or less unambiguous. Not all research designs aim to produce generalizable, conclusive findings. Included in the research design are considerations about your study's objectives, sources from which the researcher will collect the data, the approach to the analysis of the data, practical constraints, again, as discussed in the previous session, as well as ethical issues. And let's not also forget perhaps as an ubiquitous umbrella that will never leave us, our research orientation is another consideration that influences your research design. So let's see which research designs are favored by our students and have been used before in their postgraduate dissertations. The first one to consider is perhaps the least popular amongst our students, is the experimental design. The experiment is a very common form of a research design in natural sciences, not so popular in social sciences, but it has been employed in ACFIN fields to do, for example, with organizational psychology or management learning. An experimental study is associated with positivism as a research orientation and is used to study causal links between variables. For example, the researcher might wish to investigate how noise as an independent variable affects the productivity of workers, a dependent variable, and wishes to find an unambiguous response to that question. In that case, they may wish to employ an experimental design. Because it is associated with a positivist research orientation, it is also mostly employed in deductive or theory testing research. It is a very powerful methodology in offering conclusive evidence of cause-effect relationships between variables. This is because of manipulation of one variable while controlling for others, and because it fulfills the three necessary conditions for causality that you can establish through an experimental design: an empirical association, non-spuriousness, and an appropriate time order. In other words, you can demonstrate that the variables are linked, and you can empirically establish that they are linked, that the connection between them is not due to chance, and that one definitely determines the other. So the link between independent and dependent variables can be clearly established with this design. It is very suitable for application due to its structured nature. Anywhere there is manipulation possible in the social structure, you would need to assume a structured nature of the research design. It is fundamentally based on comparisons between groups, so between the manipulated group and the control group. Often it isn't a fully experimental design that one may go for in our field, but what we call a quasi-experiment. Very often management and accounting and finance research settings are not amenable to high manipulations of the type possible, for example, in a physics lab. Also, certain manipulations may be against ethical principles, so once again, these may not be possible in our research field. In that case, what one could do is a quasi-experimental design. A synthetic way of showing how an experimental design works is this one, taken from Saunders. So the control group and experimental group exist in parallel from each other, and group members are assigned at random. Dependent variables are being measured in both, and then intervention or manipulation of the dependent variable only happens in the experimental group and doesn't happen in the control group, in order to allow for measurement of the dependent variable in both groups and create findings about the difference between the two groups, hence findings about the causality between the two types of variables. Rather different than the experimental design, one may choose the cross-sectional design. It is also normally associated with a positivist research orientation, most often used in deductive theory testing research. It is typically employed to study relationships, and careful, it isn't employed to study causal links. This is the main difference between cross-sectional and experimental design. It is powerful in providing evidence that can be readily generalizable. So again, generalization is an aim with this research design as well as with the experimental design. It is quite widespread and a popular choice amongst our students due to its ease of administration, allowing access to large, diverse samples, thereby producing conclusions applying to wider populations and settings. It is also handy because it is fundamentally based on observation at a specific point in time, a snapshot, if you wish, of the reality occurring in its natural environment at a particular point in time. This is very useful for students doing a dissertation because, quite frankly, they don't have more than one point in time. A good graphic representation of how cross-sectional design works is this one. Different groups defined on the basis of different levels of the independent variable, compared at a single point in time in terms of the dependent variable. You can see why this research design would work really well with questionnaires, but we will talk about questionnaires later when we approach the issue of methods. Then we'll have the longitudinal design, another research design taken by our students. It is essentially an extension of the cross-sectional research design. It involves repeated observations, so not observations taken at a single point in time, but repeated ones over prolonged 2 or more periods of time. The intention there is to describe patterns of change. It is generally more powerful, that is, it has a better explanatory power than the cross-sectional design because of the repeated observation at the individual level and the ability to exclude time-invariant, unobserved individual differences and observe the temporal order of events. So it has the power to detect causal relationships in a way in which cross-sectional design doesn't. On the other hand, however, it is very time-consuming and resource-intensive. Quite simply, in a longitudinal design, different individuals, groups, or companies are repeatedly studied at different times along the variables of interest. And finally, for the possibly most popular research design in our field, the case study design. A case study is a methodology used to explore a single phenomenon, the case, in a natural setting using a variety of methods to obtain what is meant to be in-depth knowledge. So not nicely spread in the way cross-sectional design works, but in-depth concentrated knowledge on a particular phenomenon. The case itself can be a company, a person, an event, a phenomenon, or national culture. The case study is a very common methodology followed by primarily interpretativists, and the research design can be based on a single or multiple cases. When there are multiple cases, you deal with multiple case studies, but there is no assumption that the more cases, the better. It is just as valid to employ one case study in a case study research design. The methods used for the collection of data within a case study are interviews, observation, as well as questionnaires. Secondary data might include company archives, and the analysis can be qualitative or quantitative or both, but it is primarily based on an interpretativist research orientation and an inductive research approach. It is employed to gain an initial understanding into a complex issue. It is also very popular with new research topics. It is ideal when not much is known about an issue or phenomenon. Very powerful in examining contemporary life situations, providing the basis for the development of concepts and theories towards positivistic deductive research. It is usually criticized for not offering cause and effect relationships and for not being generalizable. But generalizable research is not the only type of research one can do. If you remember this diagram of the research process leading to theory, there are two aspects to this process. One leads from observations to the theory, and then the other one tests that theory with new observations. Case studies are really useful to the process on the left-hand side of this diagram. So theory building from observations. The richer the observations, the richer the data, the better. So we're not going for quantity here. We don't need a large number of observations. We just need in-depth exposure to the phenomenon we study. Finally, mixed methods research design is associated with a pragmatist research orientation and can be used both in inductive and deductive research. It's predicated on the premise that the given strengths of one method can be used to overcome the inherent weaknesses of the other method. So, for example, one could build on the results of a quantitative survey by conducting further interviews, so following up with qualitative data, or the other way around, building on the results of qualitative data, employing a questionnaire, so a deductive approach after following an inductive approach, and ending up with a mixed method research design. So these diagrams are possibilities for mixed methods design. Next, let's talk about data. Let's talk about data collection and see where within those research designs different data collection methods can be found.